Yeah, so let's get started. Um, I introduced you to a concept uh, yesterday towards the end of the lecture, and that concept is actually called deconstruction. Um, and this particular concept actually sees some kind of this is attributed to Jacques Derrida, and Derrida is a Frenchman like Michel Foucault, who also was a Frenchman, and Derrida is slightly different from Michel Foucault. I told you that quite a few people have in the past uh, claimed that uh, Michel Foucault is a structuralist. And I'm not going to go back to that. If you want, just look at those lectures that I posted on YouTube, what structuralism is. And I had spoken to you about Claude Levi-Strauss. I also wanted to actually speak about Louis Althusser, but we don't really have the liberty to do so. Anyway, so many people call him a structuralist, and there is a structuralist dimension to Foucault, even though he denies it. He says, I am not a structuralist, and when people asked him to, sorry, uh, people asked him to characterize himself, he characterized himself as a, a historian of ideas. Uh, but when he wrote, or rather in this lecture that he gave, which has since become available as some kind, as a piece of writing, what is an author? In 1969, I told you this was against Roland Barthes' idea, or rather his essay, which he wrote in 1967. Roland Barthes wrote this essay called Death of an Author, in which I told you the emphasis is on two things. One is that once the author puts the text out in the public sphere, it does not, he loses complete control over the text. It now becomes the audience is the reader, and the reader will basically, look at it from his point of view. He will not necessarily look at it from the point of view of, he will not look at it from the point of view of, um, sorry, sorry about this. He will not look at it from the point of view of the author. So in his essay, What is an Author? I told you there is a construction of a triangle by Foucault, in which you have the author, and the author is a functional principle. And along with the author, you do find, apart from the author, you have the text created by the author, which Roland Barthes says is not always a clear thing. It's not clear because not always are our thoughts very clear. And if we don't have clear thoughts, then there is ambiguity of expression. That's what Roland Barthes had claimed. And in his lecture again in about what an author is or what is an author, Foucault claims that the author is a functional principle who becomes a certain kind of, he is the one who decides what to exclude, what to include, and set the limits of meanings of words that he is using. Okay, so he therefore says that the author is, he begins as a functional principle and ends up as being an ideological figure. Okay, so he's promoting a certain kind of ideas. Now, this is something that is disagreed to. This is what I told you is the archaeology kind of thing. This is something that Jacques Derrida disagrees with Foucault over. Okay, uh, Derrida is classified as a post-structuralist. Now, when you say somebody is a post-structuralist, you have to be very careful in interpreting the word post. You'll also find David Easton. I don't know if you have been taught David Easton at any point. Usually David Easton is taught in political analysis, but you don't really have a subject called political analysis. In Indian politics, when people talk about it, people do talk about David Easton, and people also uh, talk about what is actually called post-behavioralism. Okay, behavioralism was a movement that came up in America, and post-behavioralism does not necessarily mean after behavioralism. Okay, because when you say post, it means after. Okay, so post the death of Gandhi, you say something like that, where that means that Gandhi is no more and something else has replaced it. But in the case of post-behavioralism and in the case of post-structuralism, with which we are concerned right now, the usage of post is slightly different. It is different because of the fact that people are not saying that this is after behavioralism or after structuralism. Okay, which means they are not giving up. I'm not going to talk about behavioralism, though the meaning is similar here. So I'm only going to now say talk about structuralism. Post-structuralism is not giving up the main ideas of structuralism. Okay, that ideas are contained in the structure of language, right? So that is something that you have to understand. It doesn't give up on the fundamental idea of what structuralism is, but it differs in the way in which it interprets uh, texts. It differs from the way in which uh, the structuralists look at the use of language and the necessity to study language in a particular fashion. Just let me give you one very small example of Louis Althusser. Uh, it's not a long example and it won't clear anything terribly for you. I'll probably talk about him when we do Rousseau, because there is a book written by Louis, Louis, Louis Althusser, Althusser. Louis Althusser wrote a book called Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Marx. Okay, in which he basically analyzes the kind of language used by these three thinkers. I'm not going to go into the details of that. I'll take the example of Rousseau. He takes the example of Rousseau and says that we have a tendency to believe that Rousseau is somebody who created a social contract. Okay, that there is a creation of a social contract in his work, which is called the Contrat Social in French, or the social contract in English. Okay, he says even though Rousseau thinks he has created a social contract, Althusser claims that if you analyze the language, if you break down the sentences into their component parts and then try to understand what Rousseau did, he says Rousseau only created a precondition for a social contract, and he did not have a social contract at all. So that is how structuralism functions. Okay. And this obviously is not, you can't possibly say that Rousseau did not create a social contract at all when he says, I have. Okay, so if you kind of look too much and too deep into verbiage or language, then you can end up with these kind of conclusions. Now, Jacques Derrida, this is typical structuralism, what I told you now about Louis Althusser. Okay, and if you look at Jacques Derrida, he becomes a post-structuralist in the sense that, yes, there are structures. Knowledge is created through structures of language or the particular use of a certain kind of structure of language. He says to that extent, structuralism is fine, but beyond that, it is not. So he agrees with the idea that the author is uh, is a functional figure. He agrees with that idea, but he will not agree with the idea that the author is also an ideological, uh, functional principle, sorry. An author is a functional principle, but not necessarily an ideologue or an ideological figure. He says his emphasis shifts from the author to the reader. Okay, and he says it is up to the reader to weed out the chaff from the grain of the text that he is reading. And that for him is possible through what he calls deconstruction. Okay, and I told you his primary enthusiasm for deconstruction came from Martin Heidegger and his idea of destruct in German, Destruct, which is destroy in English. Uh, so Heidegger was saying, if you want to find the meaning of something, destroy that. Okay, rip it apart, rip the verbiage apart, and you'll get the meaning. So this, according to Jacques Derrida, is a very, very it's an extreme thing to say, to destroy. So he says, let us use something which is a little more palatable and probably a little more realistic as well, which is let us deconstruct. Okay. So funnily enough, though he is partially on the side of Rousseau, not Rousseau, sorry, on the side of Foucault, because Foucault, he agrees with the idea that the author is a functional figure, but he disagrees with the idea that he's a functional principle, sorry, and he disagrees with the idea that he is an ideological figure. He says he needn't be. The reader need not accept the author of a text as an ideological figure. So what he suggests is deconstruction. So what exactly do we mean by deconstruction? It's an extremely complicated idea. The Frenchmen, for some strange reason, have created a linguistic philosophy, or a philosophy based in linguistics, which is so full of bombastic words and terminology that it is not easy to understand. But against Barth, you see that there is a writing by Derrida where he says the death of Barth, or death of Roland Barthes, okay, because he wrote it as death of, but Roland Barthes wrote that essay, death of an author. Here he has named the author the death of Roland Barthes, okay, and he, which basically means that he is contending against the idea that, you know, there is no cogency in the text of an author, and that the author ceases to be of control once the text is in the public sphere. He's partially with him about the text not being in the control of the author. Here is where he is against Foucault when he's saying that he can be a functional principle, the author, but he's not really an ideological figure. Now, what Derrida claims is that if you look at a text, then the text has a lot of words. Okay, and he says these words are all those which conform to syntax. Okay, when it says it conforms to syntax, what he means is it conforms to grammar. So in terms of grammar, sentences are meaningful. But in terms of semiotics, or semiology as it was called in Europe, which is the study of symbols, and I told you that language is also used symbolically. Okay, I've given you that example of infestation, right? So I'm not going to go through that again. So he says a lot of things which make sense grammatically actually hide meanings. They hide the intentions of authors. Okay. And what he says is it is up to the reader to deconstruct. So, how do you deconstruct? Now, his greatest work of about deconstruction is actually a very unreadable text called Of Grammatology, Grammatology. Okay, Of Grammatology. It's one of the most unreadable books that I have read. Now that is a bit of a contradiction, but it has taken me quite some time to break through the verbiage of Derrida. Okay, and it is an extremely complicated text, and it took me probably a year to read that thing. And I still don't know how much of it I understood very correctly. But there is an introduction to that written by uh, an Indian scholar who's now in the University of Columbia with one of my uh, inspirations to join academics, one of the greatest teachers I've had, Professor Sudipto Kaviraj. Uh, he's an amazing man, and I've had the good fortune of being taught by him. He's a political theorist, and it is through him that I have learned a lot of political theory. He and one Gurpreet Mahajan and Sanjay Palshikar. These are the three people who have helped me master in to whatever degree the political theory, political philosophy, political thought, all these things. Now, Gayatri Spivak, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, her husband's last name is Spivak. Uh, we pronounce it as Spivak, and he, I think, is of Hungarian origin, and it is Spivak in Hungarian, but the Americans pronounce it as Spivak, Spivak. So Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak wrote an introduction to of grammatology, and I have had the good fortune of doing a non-credit course under her. I did a non-credit course on linguistic philosophy with her. Non-credit in the sense that the grade that you get will not be added to what you have got in your entire course. It doesn't have any credits, but it'll let people know that you have studied this as well. And I studied this under her directly, so it was one of my good fortunes. I think I was born at a time when all these things were possible, became possible, so I should consider myself privileged and very, very lucky. For most of my life, I've had great teachers. And anyway, what Gayatri Spivak or Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak says is, if you want to understand Derrida, then you should understand the concept of what is called reading under erasure. Okay, reading under erasure. Now, typically, what happens, let me see if I can annotate and show it to you here. Well, it says annotate. I'll do it with the mouse and text. No, the mouse is fine. Is it drawing? No, it is not. Draw. Yeah. No, let me not waste time. It's not happening. Reading under erasure is what you do is you read a sentence in a particular book, or you read many sentences which make a paragraph. What you do is you see that there are certain words that are not in any way contributing to the idea that is there in the book, okay, that the author is trying to convey. So you put a bracket, okay, on those words. Just please put a bracket like this and a into symbol, this symbol in the brackets over those words, which means those words are redundant or useless in generating meanings about the text. In fact, Derrida calls these words as distractions. He says these are distractions, and these distractions, so to speak, are the ones that uh, you know, take your focus away from where it should be. So it is bracketing and putting a cross, which basically means that read without those words anymore. That is reading under erasure. Okay, and if you read under erasure, then you get a different meaning altogether from the text. This is what Derrida claims. And this is how we go around deconstructing texts, which is where you identify unnecessary words or words that don't have to be there in a sentence, but we put a lot of words sometimes which we don't need. Okay, so he says put bracket those, put a into mark and read the rest of the sentence. That is when you get a completely different meaning. And this is called reading under erasure, which is the main methodology of deconstruction. So when you start deconstructing, what happens is that you start getting different meanings. Now, what you have to remember here is that there is no one deconstruction, okay? Because Derrida says the reader is rooted in his own cultural milieu, okay? The reader is basically rooted in his own cultural milieu. And because of that, different readers at different times in different places identify a different set of words as those which are redundant or distracting. All don't identify the same words as being distracting or redundant. Okay, if you pick up a book like, say, The Leviathan by Hobbes, people in the 19th century would have seen things in that which they considered redundant, and so they would read a different set of words under erasure from, say, the people who are in the 20th century. In the 20th century, people will read that very differently again. They will identify a different set of words which will be seen as being a distraction or redundant. And it is also culture. It is also culture. Okay. If you look at Indians, our languages are a lot more specific. And if you take Sanskrit, it is believed worldwide that Sanskrit is the most precise language in the world. And that's why even computer programmers have taken to using Sanskrit protocol in creating new languages and programs for computers. So that precision is missing in European languages. Okay, that precision is missing. And this precision, so an Indian would find a lot many words as being redundant if he is confronted with the Leviathan in the 21st century, than say a European would find the same in the 21st century. Okay, so a text does not offer only one deconstruction. It offers many deconstructions. It offers many deconstructions, or an infinite number of deconstructions, which are a result of the intervention of culture, which is bound by the reader's culture, which is bound by time, space, and the reader's experience. These are the three most important mediating factors. And it is as per these things that people will have infinite deconstructions. So deconstruction is not something which is only, which will produce one original meaning. Okay, which is what Foucault seems to be indicating, though he doesn't use the term original meaning. When he's talking about the author going beyond the functional principle and becoming an ideological figure, then he is looking at and his archaeology is looking at the possibility of retrieval of original meanings. What did the author mean by writing this text? What did he want to show to people? What did he want to demonstrate? Okay, as opposed to that, in post-structuralism of the Derrida variety, you find that there is no original meaning. Okay, somehow, even though it is some kind of a lampooning thing to say the death of Barth, somehow if you look at this, this is upholding the same principle of Barth, Derrida's deconstruction, in a different way. In a different way. He's not putting the onus on the author. He's putting it on the reader. Okay, in Barth also, the onus is on the author. Okay, but here we find that the onus or the focus is on the reader. A reader and his cultural milieu, which is his time, space, and the nature of society that he's living in. It all leads to a certain kind of deconstruction of the text and derivation of a meaning from that. So there are no original meanings. In Derrida, what you have is the possibility of infinite meanings with the passage of time, with the emergence of new cultures, with the emergence of new or with the emerge in different places. Okay, so you get infinite deconstructions. And he said there is no reason why we should think that this is somehow not a good thing. Okay, a lot of people will think you have to understand something as it is supposed to be understood. The supposed to be understood is not what Derrida wants. He says there is no need to, there is no way you can say you have to, there is one way only in which you're supposed to understand this. It all depends upon you, your purpose. Okay, it is your purpose that will make you deconstruct a text in a certain manner, understand it in a certain manner. And each of these deconstructions is valid for the reader or readers who are located in different cultural milieus, in different places, and in different times. So, no original meaning. That is deconstruction. Against this, not against this, similarly, there is another principle called reconstruction of texts and reconstruction of meanings. This is something that was written by Hans Gadamer, a German philosopher. And most of it is actually, most of his idea of reconstruction, which is very similar to deconstruction, it is directed against Wilhelm Dilthey, okay, a German thinker who believed in the retrieval of original meanings. He thought that original meanings can be retrieved, and Gadamer said no. This is called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is interpretation. Some people pronounce hermeneutics as hermeneutics because hermeneutics traditionally was used in literary texts, but its application to social science texts was done by the Germans. And Germans pronounce EU as oi. So hermeneutics is what they say, but the actual this thing is hermeneutics. I'll pick this up tomorrow, and tomorrow we are definitely through with this.